All right, welcome back to Close Up. We want to run through a couple of big fundraising numbers that came out this week. We're going to start with Democratic Congressman and Senate candidate, of course, Paul Hodes. He had the biggest announcement, at least in some minds. He pulled in a little more than $700,000 in the last 3 months of 2009 for the campaign so far. He's at $2.2 million, and cash on hand brings in at just over $1.4 million. Also out this week, Republican frontrunner in many minds, Kelly Ayotte. She contrasted Hodes, but she didn't do quite as well as a lot of people thought she would. $630,000 in the fourth quarter. That brings her total up to $1.24 million, with a little under $1 million on hand at the end of 2009. And while Hodes is running unopposed in the primary, Ayotte, of course, does have challengers, and here's where she stacks up so far in that money battle. In terms of cash on hand, she's in between Bill Binney and Jim Bender, both businessmen who did, by the way, give themselves significant personal loans to get themselves into the picture. Over LaMontagne hasn't released his numbers, at least as of Friday. And so that's what I want to talk about. Let's bring you guys back in here. Let's talk about Hodes and Ayotte and their fundraising numbers. Start with you, Mike. This was a surprise in a lot of minds that Hodes outpaced Ayotte.
First, starting with Kelly Ayotte, I don't know a single person who actually wasn't terribly impressed with her fundraising number. And it was more than her third quarter.
Maybe not the number itself, but the fact that the Hodes outpaced her.
Oh, well, I guess that shouldn't reflect on Kelly. That was a great surprise and very impressive number for Congressman Hodes, especially given that he's been on the ropes. He's been feeling the pressure from the bad news coming out of Washington, the economy, his support of the stimulus, his support of the health care, the government takeover plan. So and still, in showing him losing to Kelly Ayotte, to Over LaMontagne, he's still been able to raise a substantial amount of money. Hats off to him, and congratulations. It's good news for Paul Hodes, but it is still good news for Kelly Ayotte, and clearly Jim Bender and Bill Binney they're going to be fighting tooth and nail right straight through in this primary.
I think first, Paul Hodes is continuing to have a very successful fundraising effort, and I don't want people to get distracted by it's all about money is one of the gauges right now. I think a lot of people thought that Kelly Ayotte was going to come in, though, and exceed him. And I think what's happening there is that the Republican race is changing very quickly. I mean, a few months ago, the Republican leadership, many in the Republican leadership in Washington, had sort of self-anointed Kelly Ayotte as their nominee. They were doing fundraisers for her, a lot of activity in D.C. Now, Bill Binney and some of the other candidates over LaMontagne have been able to chip away at that. And I think there's a nervousness amongst a lot of the leadership that maybe they should sit tight and let this primary play out without interference. And, we've seen races where Republican interference, the New York congressional race last year, caused a big upset. So I think, the old saying that you get your low-lying fruit early on and it gets tougher as time goes on to raise money, that's what we're going to need to be watching right now. But I think that Republican primary race has changed dramatically. The leadership in Washington is starting to step back and say, we should let New Hampshire do their own thing. So Kelly Ayotte's numbers may start to dwindle as we see others go up. Now, Bill Binney, his numbers are never going to go down because he's got the ability to self-fund this as he needs it to be. So you're going to see Binney's numbers significant because he's going to be pumping his own cash.
He's been on television already. Jim Bender's going to be on TV pretty soon. And while money may not be job one in a campaign, a lot of people think it's 1A anyway.
Here's another thing to keep in mind. That you take all the Republicans' numbers combined in the Senate race, and it dramatically outpaces Paul Hodes' fundraising numbers. So the bottom line is Republicans, independents, are motivated to give money to beat back the Democrat government takeover of health care in Washington, all of the overreach and the overspending in Washington. They're very motivated to change, real change this time in Washington in the 2010 elections, and I think that's what's going to be the interesting thing to watch.
But I'll tell you, too, one other area to watch, not in this reporting cycle, but the next two to come, is the impact of this recent court decision on corporate money. Because I don't think anyone will argue that it's more likely that significant corporate money is going to find its way into Republican races than Democratic races. And so this will be a real test, particularly that Senate race, to see if corporations are going to start stepping up and spending big amounts of money. And if that happens, then I do think you're going to see Republican candidates start to move out somewhat with their fundraising. But I think the risk that they have is that the American people may become offended if all of a sudden those finance reports show that the campaigns are being funded directly by big corporations in America. So this is going to be an interesting element to watch as the cycle goes on.
Let's move over to the congressional race real quick. Carol Shea Porter raised $174,000 in the fourth quarter, and that puts her overall total raised at a little more than $500,000, $547,000 to $400,000 on hand. Good number, Jim?
Yes, good number for a congressional race. I mean, sometimes we get distracted by the U.S. Senate races, which generate so much money. But, I mean, if you look at historically, if a candidate can keep a pace of raising $100,000 to $200,000 each quarter, they're going to be able to fund their campaign very well in New Hampshire. So her numbers, I think, were very good.
Flip side of that, Mike, you have former Congressman Charlie Bass. He's as an exploratory committee right now, but he checked in with $147,000 in the fourth quarter, has more than $160,000 on hand. Pretty good numbers, I'd say, for someone who's not officially in the race.
Yeah, I would say I think Jim's exactly right. If you can show between $100,000 and $200,000 a quarter, those are right on par, right on pace for where you want to be competitive and raising and spending money through the election.
I also want to point out two Democrats that have money of their own to spend. Ann McLean Custer reported raising about $500,000 last year. Katrina Sweat enters the campaign with about $800,000 in the bank from her 2008 campaign, still waiting for the rest of the fundraising numbers to come in from other areas. But how do you guys see this thing shaking out in either race? Certainly it's early, but money becomes more and more important, so does name recognition and momentum.
And that's why I think what's going on in Washington is going to play a huge role. Candidates have generally been raising the money they need to run these campaigns, but what's happening in Washington, especially this spring, what goes on and with the administration and the proposals they're pushing and which way they really push, I think will have a huge impact. And if the American people continue to be frustrated with what's going on, if the economy isn't getting better. You know, with this, the stimulus that was passed last year was promised 8% unemployment. It's still at 10%, and they're still pushing for a second stimulus bill. It's just outrageous. And the American people, I expect, are not going to stand for it much longer.
I think if you look at the second district race, if money is an indication, that is going to be a real Donnybrook. First of all, Ann McLean Custer, I think, has exceeded all expectations. I mean, to make it through the first year raising over $500,000, having never been a candidate before, is very impressive. Katrina Sweat has now just started to really ramp up her campaign, but she enters it with over $800,000 or $900,000 in the bank that she's raised previously. So you've got two Democratic candidates there, I think, positioned very well financially to be aggressive in this campaign. Charlie Bass shouldn't be a surprise. He's a former congressman. He's certainly got a lot of connections in Washington to raise money. So that race, I think, has the makings of being a really interesting race. Now, we're all waiting to see what Frank Ginta's numbers look like in this past quarter because, you know, you've got to keep pace. Once you start to slow off, it starts to have an impact on your fundraising down the road. I would say that if Frank Ginta can't keep the same pace that he had, if he can't hit $100,000, there's going to be some questions about whether it's viable.
Worcester being built. We'll see how they get applied. We're out of time, guys. That's going to wrap up this edition of Close Up New Hampshire. Thanks for watching. See you back here next Sunday.